The sun was dipping low over the Arizona plains, turning the sky into a fire-streaked canvas of gold and crimson. The land was quiet, except for the rustle of dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the canyons. It was the hour when the desert changed its face, when the heat softened, and the shadows grew long enough to hide both the hunter and the hunted. Riding through that silence came an Apache warrior, his horse moving slow, hooves pressing into the cracked earth like whispers of the past. His eyes, dark and steady, searched the horizon the way a man searches for ghosts he doesn't want to find, but knows are out there waiting. He had been tracking a scent, not of blood or prey, but of wrongness. It hung in the air heavier than the dust, a feeling that something cruel had been left behind. The land carried memories like old scars, and he could read them the broken twig. The half-buried boot print, the faint trail leading toward the remains of a burned wagon. The smoke had long vanished, but the ash still told stories. He dismounted, crouched low, and touched the ground, feeling the warmth fading beneath his palm. Someone had been here not long ago, and someone else had not left by choice. He moved carefully, listening. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound, a cry so weak it could have been mistaken for the moan of the wind itself. But he knew the difference. He followed it past a tumble of rocks and down a slope toward an abandoned post near the edge of a dry riverbed. There, in the dim light, he saw something that made his blood still. A wooden sign stood planted in the ground, crooked and half-rotten. Carved into it, in rough English letters, was a single word: property. Beneath that sign, chained to a post like an animal, was a woman. She was barely conscious, her hair tangled and full of dust, her face turned toward the dying sun, as if trying to remember what warmth felt like. Her wrists were bound with iron, skin rubbed raw beneath the metal. The chain clinked faintly when she tried to move, but she was too weak to fight it anymore. For a moment, the warrior just stood there silent, the weight of what he saw pressing deep into his chest. He had seen cruelty before, too much of it, but something about this struck a different chord. It wasn't just pain that clung to her. It was shame carved into her by the same hands that had nailed that sign into the ground. He looked around, scanning for tracks. There were several boot prints, wagon marks, the signs of a struggle. Whoever had done this had left in a hurry. Maybe they thought no one would come this way. Maybe they didn't care. The Apache tightened his jaw. This land had once been free, every hill and stone carrying the stories of his people. Now, signs like that property were being planted across it, claiming the earth, the rivers, even the lives of those too weak to resist. He had seen men whipped for trespassing on their own soil. He had seen women traded like horses for debts that weren't theirs. But this was something deeper. It was the kind of cruelty that came from men who believed the word ownership gave them power over another.
Also,
The woman stirred as he stepped closer. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with exhaustion and fear. When she saw him, she tried to shrink away, the chain rattling. Her voice came out dry and broken. "Don't hurt me. Please," he stopped, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "You are safe now," he said softly. His English carried a rough edge, but the tone in his voice carried truth. She blinked at him, confused, as if the word safe no longer meant anything real. The warrior knelt beside her, examining the lock on the chain. It was heavy iron, made for holding cattle or worse. He pulled a small knife from his belt and started working at it. She tried to speak again, but her throat gave out. He handed her a small water skin from his saddle. She hesitated before drinking, as though expecting even that to be taken from her. The way she held it, cautious, almost reverent, told him she had been denied the simplest kindness for too long as she drank. His eyes fell again on the word burned into the wooden sign. Property. He reached out and yanked it from the ground, snapping the post in half with a single motion. The woman flinched at the sound, but he didn't look at her. His jaw was tight, and his knuckles were white around the splintered wood. That word had been written across to many hearts already. The last light of the sun faded. A darkness began to settle across the land. The desert cooled, carrying with it the smell of sage and dry wind. The warrior finally broke the lock with a hard twist, freeing her wrists. She slumped forward, catching herself just in time. He helped her sit, his hands steady, but careful not to frighten her. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with questions that neither dared to ask yet. When she finally found her voice again, it was barely above a whisper. "They left me here," she said. "Said I wasn't worth the trouble. Just left me to die." Her words trembled in the air, fragile and bitter. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Men who do such things think the land belongs to them," he said quietly. "But the land remembers. It always does." Her eyes searched his face as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. There was something about him, something steady and unyielding, like the mountains behind them. He didn't ask who she was or what she had done to end up here. Maybe he already knew it didn't matter. Pain had a way of making strangers equal. He lifted her gently onto his horse. The animal shifted, but stayed calm, as if it too understood. She leaned weakly against the saddle, eyes closing for a moment. The warrior looked once more at the broken post, at the empty space where the sign had stood. Then he turned away, leading the horse back toward the darkening trail. The desert stretched endless ahead of them, silent except for the rhythmic sound of hooves and the soft rattle of her chain still hanging from one wrist. He would cut it off once they stopped. For now it was a reminder, a question that still needed answering. Who had done this, and why? The night grew colder, stars blooming across the sky like distant fires. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing across the canyon walls. The warrior didn't speak, but his thoughts were sharp and restless. He had found the woman by chance, but he didn't believe in chance anymore. The land had a way of leading him to what needed to be seen, to what needed to be set right. And something about this felt bigger than one woman's suffering. There was a pattern beneath it. A thread connecting the cruelty spreading across these plainsmen, building empires on bones. Calling it civilization, when they stopped near a small stream, he helped her down and built a small fire. The light flickered over their faces, casting long shadows. She sat quietly, clutching a blanket he had wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the flames, lost somewhere far away. The warrior spoke only once. "You are free now," he said. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Free," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. Then her gaze shifted toward the dark horizon. "They'll come looking for me," she said. He looked up sharply. Her lips parted, but before she could answer, the faint sound of hooves echoed in the distance. The warrior rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the handle of his blade. The woman's eyes widened, fear flashing in them again. The firelight danced across her face, and for the first time he saw it clearly, the mark of a brand half-faded. Just above her collarbone, it was the same word burned into that wooden sign: property. The sound of hooves drew closer. The warrior's jaw tightened, and the fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the dark, unseen riders were approaching, and the woman's trembling hand gripped the edge of her blanket as if it could shield her. From the past that was now riding toward them, the warrior took one slow breath, the kind a man takes before stepping into the unknown. The night around them held its breath too. What came next would change everything. The night was so still that every sound seemed to echo twice, once in the air and once deep inside the bones. The Apache warrior stood by the fire, his body motionless except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. Across from him, the woman sat close to the flames, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The distant hoofbeats came and went, fading into the dark like a warning carried by the wind. He didn't move until the silence settled again. His eyes stayed fixed on the direction of the sound, as if waiting for it to return. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You said they would come for you. Who are they?" She hesitated, looking down at the ground. Her hands trembled slightly, but her tone was steady when she answered. "Men from the ranch north of the canyon. They took me there months ago. I was supposed to work, clean, cook, but when I tried to leave, they said I belonged to them." Her voice caught on the last words, the memory clearly too raw to explain. "When I wouldn't do what they wanted, they punished me. Then they left me there to die." The warrior said nothing for a long time. He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks drifting upward. "That ranch," he said finally, "it belongs to a man named Dalton. I have seen his riders before. They think everything under this sky can be bought." Her eyes lifted, faintly startled that he knew the name. "You know him?" "I know his kind," the warrior said. His tone carried no anger, just quiet certainty. "Men like him take what they want and call it law." The firelight flickered over his face, carving shadows along the sharp lines of his jaw and cheekbones. He looked like part of the land itself, worn, watchful, unbroken. The woman studied him for a moment before asking softly, "Why did you help me?" He looked toward the horizon where the sound of horses had vanished. "Because I have seen too many signs like that one. Too many chains." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain far away in the mountains. The woman leaned slightly toward the warmth of the fire. "What is your name?" He didn't answer right away, as if the question belonged to a world he had left behind. "They call me Koa," he said at last. "It means warrior." She nodded slowly. "My name is Alara," she said. The way she spoke it made it sound almost unfamiliar to her, like a name she hadn't heard in a long time. "I used to think names meant something, but when they chained me there, they didn't use mine. They said a woman doesn't need a name if she's owned." Koa's gaze softened, but his voice stayed steady. "You are not owned." Alara didn't respond. She just stared at the flames, her mind drifting somewhere far away. The night grew colder, and the sound of a coyote's cry rose in the distance, lonely and long. Koa reached into his saddlebag and took out a piece of dried meat, offering it to her. She hesitated, then took it with a faint nod of thanks. For a while, they ate in silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the quiet breathing of his horse nearby. Then Koa stood and moved toward the shadows, scanning the dark horizon once more. He knew the riders hadn't gone far. Men who owned signs like that didn't give up what they believed was theirs. When he returned to the fire, Alara was staring at the sky. "I used to think the stars meant freedom," she said softly. "When I was a girl, I'd lie in the grass and count them, thinking one day I'd follow them to a better place. But when I was chained, I looked up, and they looked back the same way, as if they didn't care what happened down here." Koa sat beside her, his eyes following hers to the sky. "The stars don't choose sides," he said, "but they remember every story. Someday they will remember yours too." The fire burned low. Alara's head dropped slightly, exhaustion finally weighing her down. Koa watched her for a moment, then stood and covered her with a second blanket from his pack. When he looked again toward the canyon, a faint light flickered in the far-distant torches, moving slowly along the ridge. He knew then that the riders had not turned back. He kept watch through the night. The moon rose high and pale, washing the land in silver. Memories came and went like the shifting wind, the faces of his people, the sound of laughter that had once filled the canyons, and the sight of soldiers riding through his village years ago, burning homes and calling it progress. He remembered the same kind of signs hammered into the ground. Afterward, property, territory, reservation. Words that had stolen more than just land. When dawn came, he awoke Alara gently. Her eyes blinked open, confused for a moment by the light. "We have to move," he said. "They're not far." She nodded, though fear flickered across her face. "Where will we go?" "There's a valley 2 days' ride from here," he said. "Few men go there. You'll be safe." She looked doubtful. "And what about you?" Koa tightened the saddle straps. "My path is not finished yet." They started riding just as the first light spilled across the hills. The air was cool, carrying the smell of mesquite and dust. Alara rode behind him, holding on carefully, her eyes scanning the open land, as if expecting danger to rise from the ground itself. Koa guided the horse along the narrow trail between the rocks, keeping low and away from the open plain. He knew this land well, its hidden paths, its dry creeks, its secret places where the wind itself seemed to whisper warnings. As they rode, she asked quietly, "Were you always alone?" He didn't answer right away. "Once I had a family," he said finally. "But the soldiers came when I was a boy. They burned our camp, took my father's rifle, and said the land was no longer ours. I learned early that a man who trusts the word of others loses more than just his home. Ilara looked down. Then why risk yourself for me? Koa's jaw tightened. Because someone once saved me too. A man I barely knew. He said the only way to fight cruelty is to break its chain wherever you find it. I didn't understand then. Now I do. The trail curved upward into the foothills, where the air grew cooler and the sound of running water could be heard faintly ahead. But as they climbed, Koa noticed new tracks in the dirt-fresh horses, heading the same way. He dismounted, studying them closely. They know this route, he murmured. Ilara's grip on the saddle tightened. Can we hide? He shook his head. Not here. The land is open. We keep moving. They pushed forward through the rising light, the sun breaking over the horizon like a blade of fire. Sweat streaked Koa's brow, and the horse snorted from the climb. Each mile stretched longer than the last. The silence between them carried the weight of what waited behind. By midday, they reached the edge of a dry canyon. The walls were high and narrow, casting sharp shadows over the ground. Koa stopped the horse and dismounted again, listening. From far below came the faint murmur of water. We'll rest there, he said, motioning downward. They climbed carefully along a narrow path until they reached the stream below. It was shallow, but cool and clear. Ilara knelt by it, cupping water into her hands. I don't remember the last time I felt clean, she said softly. Koa looked away, giving her quiet. He scanned the rocks above, but the canyon was still. For now, they were safe, as the day went on. Ilara began to speak, more fragments of her story spilling out between long pauses. She had come west with her father, a carpenter who believed the frontier offered a fresh start. But when he fell sick and passed away, she was left with debts. Dalton's men had offered her work, and she had accepted, not knowing the price. Once on his land, she was told she could not leave. The sheriff ignored her pleas. Everyone did. Koa listened without interruption. When she finished, her voice trembling with exhaustion, he said quietly, "This land makes men forget they have hearts." Ilara nodded, her eyes glistening. Then why stay here? Why not go somewhere else? Because running doesn't change the world, he said. Only standing does. A faint rumble interrupted them, thunder rolling across the distance, though no clouds were near. Koa stood, hand on his knife. Not thunder, he said softly. Hooves. Ilara looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. They found us? He listened a moment longer, then nodded once. They're close. The sound grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls. Koa helped her to her feet, eyes scanning for a way out. The trail they'd used was too narrow to climb quickly. The only escape was through the stream deeper into the canyon where the light barely reached. He turned to her. Stay behind me. Whatever happens, do not stop. She hesitated, her voice shaking. What if they catch us? Koa met her eyes, his expression calm but fierce. Then they will find more than what they came for. The sound of riders filled the air, growing clearer now shouts, the crack of reins, the ring of metal. Dust began to rise along the canyon rim. Koa stepped forward, his hand tightening on his blade as the first shadow crossed above them. The fire in his chest was not anger, but something older, something born of memory and loss. The land around him seemed to hold its breath again, as if waiting for a story it had heard too, many times to end differently this time. And as the first rider appeared against the sun, the word from that broken sign echoed in both their minds, a reminder of what was at stake. Property. But this time, the land itself seemed ready to fight back. Dust swirled in the air as the riders reached the rim of the canyon. Their silhouettes loomed large against the rising sun, rifles glinting faintly in the morning light. The echo of hooves bounced off the rocky walls, filling the narrow gorge like the beat of a drum announcing trouble. Koa pressed his hand against the canyon wall, studying the movement above. He counted at least 5 riders. Their voices drifted faintly down, laughing in a way that had nothing to do with humor. Ilara stayed close behind him, her breath uneven. She could hear the horses snorting, the jingle of spurs, the bark of orders. Every sound brought the fear back into her bones. Koa motioned for silence and pointed downstream where the canyon narrowed. The stream ran shallow, but steady there, leading into a darker cut between two stone ridges. If they could reach that passage before being spotted, they might disappear into the maze of cliffs that twisted for miles beyond. They moved quietly, stepping into the cold water to muffle their tracks. The chill bit at their ankles, but Koa didn't slow. He moved like a shadow, one hand on his blade, the other guiding Alara along the uneven stones. She stumbled once, catching herself with a soft gasp. He glanced back, his eyes sharp but calm, urging her forward. Above them, the riders dismounted. Voices carried down more clearly now. "Tracks end here," one of them said. They went into the canyon. Another voice replied, rough and familiar. "Then we follow. Dalton said to bring her back breathing if we can. He wants to handle her himself." The mention of that name hit Alara like a strike to the chest. Her steps faltered, and Koa turned sharply toward her. The fear on her face said more than words could. He motioned for her to keep going and whispered, "Do not let them find you afraid. Men like that feed on it." They pushed deeper into the canyon, where the walls closed in and the light dimmed. The sound of pursuit grew louder, echoing closer with every passing second. Then a sharp crack split the air. A rifle shot. Stone shattered near Koa's shoulder, sending dust and fragments flying. Alara ducked instinctively, covering her head. Koa pulled her behind a large boulder, crouching low as another shot rang out. "They see us," she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he studied the canyon ahead. The stream twisted left into a narrow tunnel carved by centuries of floodwater. It was barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways, but beyond it lay open desert, a chance to escape. He looked back toward the ridge where the gunmen were gathering. Their voices grew clearer now, their laughter cruel. "We'll flush them out," one said. "Ain't no place to hide down there." Koa turned to Alara. "Can you run?" She nodded, though her legs trembled. "I'll try. When I say go, you take the tunnel. Do not stop until you see the light on the other side. I'll be right behind you." She looked at him, fear flickering into doubt. "You'll get killed." "Not today," he said. And there was something in his tone that made her believe him, even if she didn't understand why. He stepped out from behind the boulder, crouched low, and threw a small stone down the opposite side of the canyon. It clattered loudly, drawing a shout from above. A shot followed the sound, and Koa seized the moment. "Go," he hissed. Alara sprinted toward the narrow tunnel, her bare feet slipping on the wet rock. The chain that still clung to her wrist rattled faintly, echoing like a cruel reminder of where she had come from. Behind her, Koa moved swiftly, using the canyon walls for cover as bullets struck around him. The riders were firing blind, their shouts filling the air with anger and confusion. By the time Alara reached the tunnel, she had to turn sideways to fit through. The rocks scraped her shoulders, and darkness swallowed her almost completely. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears and the faint sound of Coa's movements behind her. Somewhere ahead, she saw a sliver of daylight, faint but real. When she finally stumbled out into the open, the sunlight felt like a shock. She fell to her knees, gasping, as Koa emerged moments later, covered in dust but unharmed. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a thicket of mesquite trees that grew along the canyon's edge. They ducked inside just as another bullet whined past, striking the rock near the tunnel mouth. For a few long moments, neither spoke. The sound of horses echoed faintly in the distance, but the riders had lost sight of them. Koa listened carefully, his body tense until the noise faded away. Then he turned to her. "They'll search the other side. We move east," she nodded, still catching her breath. "Will they stop?" He looked toward the horizon. "Men like that never stop. But neither do I." They traveled most of the day across broken hills and dry riverbeds. The land stretched endless, painted in muted shades of gold and gray. Alara said little, her thoughts tangled between fear and exhaustion. But as the hours passed, something else stirred in her, a small, quiet determination that hadn't been there before. For the first time, she wasn't waiting to be saved. She was fighting to survive, By sunset, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley below. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, campfires from a nearby ranch. Koa crouched, studying it. "That's Dalton's land," he said. "The men chasing us came from there." Alara followed his gaze. "Why would a man like him want me back so badly? He already took everything." Koa's eyes stayed fixed on the smoke. "Because power doesn't like to be defied," he ran. "That means someone else might think they can too." She turned toward him, her expression changing. "Have you fought him before?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "Years ago, his men took my brother. They said he stole cattle. He didn't. They hung him from a tree near the river. The sheriff said nothing." Her heart sank. "I'm sorry." Koa looked away. "Don't be. I buried my brother beneath the Redstone Hills. Since then, I've been waiting for the wind to carry me where I'm needed most." They camped that night under a grove of twisted pines near the ridge. The air was cooler there, carrying the scent of smoke and sage. Koa built a small fire, careful to shield it from view. Alara sat across from him, watching the flames dance. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if the world will ever stop belonging to men like Dalton?" Koa poked at the fire with a stick. "The world belongs to those who remember what it cost to build it. They don't remember, but we do." The silence stretched, heavy but not empty. In that quiet, something fragile began to take shape between them, not romance. Not yet, but understanding. The kind that grows when two people share the same wound, even if it was cut in different ways. Later, as the fire burned low, Koa stood and walked to the edge of the ridge. He looked out at the stars spreading across the sky. The same stars his ancestors had watched when the world was younger and freer. Behind him, Alara lay awake, staring at the flickering firelight. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew the man who had saved her wasn't just running from danger. He was running towards something larger, something that had been waiting in the dust for too long. Before dawn, Koa woke her. "They're moving again," he said quietly. "I saw torches in the valley. They're tracking us by the stream." It packed quickly, the sound of saddle straps and shifting earth, the only noise. As they rode toward the east, the land opened wide again, the horizon a vast stretch of pale light. But behind them, faint and relentless, the smoke from Dalton's riders followed like a shadow that refused to die. By mid-morning, the trail split in two. Koa stopped, studying the tracks that crossed their path. These were different, lighter, careful. Someone else had passed through recently, and not one of Dalton's men. He crouched to inspect them, his brow furrowing. Alara leaned forward. "Who is it?" "Someone who doesn't want to be found," he said. "But they're watching." She looked around nervously. "You think they'll help us?" Koa straightened, his expression unreadable. "Help is not free in this land. But sometimes, enemies have enemies too." He led her off the main trail, toward a hidden valley surrounded by sandstone cliffs. There, nestled between the rocks, was a small settlement, half a dozen tents, and a few wooden shelters. Smoke rose from a fire pit in the center. People moved quietly among them, their faces weathered but alert. These were outcasts, Koa realized. Survivors from both sides of a war that never truly ended. A tall man stepped forward as they approached, rifle slung across his shoulder. His voice was low, but wary. "You bring trouble with you, Apache." Koa met his gaze steadily. Trouble was already coming. We just gave it a face. The man's eyes shifted to Alara, then back to Koa. After a moment, he nodded toward the tents. "You can rest for now. But if Dalton's men come here, we fight together or we die together." As Koa led Alara toward the camp, she looked around, sensing the tension that hung in the air. These people were broken, but they were not defeated. Something about the place felt like a storm gathering strength. She turned to Koa and whispered, "You think this is where it ends?" He looked at the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher, washing the desert in gold. "No," he said softly. "This is where it begins." And somewhere beyond the cliffs, the riders were still coming, their torches glowing like small, angry stars. The desert held its breath once again. waiting to see whose story would be written in the dust next. The wind carried a low hum across the valley that night, stirring the dry grass around the small camp. The people gathered there spoke in hushed tones, faces lit by the faint orange glow of the fires. Somewhere beyond the ridges, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from hooves beating against the desert floor. Dalton's men were coming, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they reached them. Koa stood apart from the others, sharpening his blade with slow, steady movements. His eyes followed the line of the horizon, where the last light was fading. He could feel the pull of what was coming, heavy in his chest, like the calm before a storm. He had fought before, but this was different. This time the fight wasn't just about survival. It was about what kind of world would be left when the dust settled. Ilara watched him from the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of water. The outcasts had offered them food and a place to rest, but there was no peace in her heart. She could still hear the laughter of Dalton's men echoing in her memory, still feel the weight of the chain that had marked her as less than human. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the word carved into that sign property and felt the old fear creep back. But now, alongside it, there was something else, a spark of anger that had begun to take root. The man who had first spoken to them, the leader of the settlement, approached Koa. His name was Holden, former ranch hand, who had walked away from Dalton's cruelty years ago. His left hand was scarred from a branding iron, and he carried that scar like a promise. "They'll be here by morning," Holden said quietly. "You brought us warning, and for that we thank you. But if we fight on our own terms." Koa looked at him, his tone even. "I did not bring the war here, Dalton did. But if we stand together, maybe it ends here." Holden nodded slowly. "We've hidden too long. Maybe it's time we stop running." Through the night, preparations began. Men and women moved like shadows, setting traps along the valley entrance and loading what few rifles they had. Some sharpened tools that would have to serve as weapons. Others gathered stones and oil lamps to use as fire. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Ilara helped where she could, her hands trembling, but steady enough to tie knots and fill water skins. Each movement kept her mind busy, but fear still gnawed at her. She found herself drawn to Koa again and again, as if his presence alone anchored her to the moment. He spoke little, but every glance, every calm motion seemed to carry a silent strength she could lean on. Near midnight, the wind shifted. Koa stopped what he was doing and turned his head toward the west. He could smell it, the faint trace of smoke carried on the breeze. He walked up the ridge and stared into the distance. Faint lights were moving there, flickering like a swarm of fireflies. Torches. Holden joined him, rifle in hand. They're spreading out, sending riders to surround the valley. Swa's expression didn't change. "Then we make them come where we want them." Down below, the others gathered, their faces pale but determined. Holden's voice rose just enough to reach them. "You all know what's coming. Dalton thinks he owns this land, just like he thinks he owns people. Tonight, we show him he's wrong." Koa stepped forward, his voice low but strong. "They fight with fear. Don't give it to them. Every man here knows the land better than they do. Let the earth fight with us." The words settled over them like a silent vow. By dawn, the air was heavy with dust and tension. The first line of riders appeared on the ridge, 20 men, maybe more. Their silhouettes grew larger as they descended, moving with the arrogance of those who had never been challenged. Front rode Dalton himself, a tall man with a wide hat and a face carved from stone. His coat was fine leather, his boots polished, but his eyes were cold. When the riders reached the edge of the camp, they stopped. Dalton's voice carried easily across the open space. "You've made a mistake, Apache. That woman belongs to me. You hand her over now, and maybe I'll forget the rest of you exist." Ilara's breath caught. Even hearing his voice made her knees weak. But Koa stepped forward, calm and unflinching. "No one belongs to you." Dalton's expression darkened. "You think you can stand against me? You and this band of strays? You'll die for something that isn't even yours?" Koa's jaw tightened. "Freedom is everyone's to fight for, even yours, though you threw it away long ago." A flicker of anger flashed in Dalton's eyes, but he forced a smile. "You talk like a preacher. Let's see if your God saves you today." Raised his hand, and the riders spread out, forming a half circle around the valley. Koa turned to Holden. "Wait for my signal," he said quietly. "They'll strike first." "That's their mistake." The ground trembled as the riders charged. Shouts filled the air, followed by the crack of gunfire. The first wave hit hard, bullets tearing into the dust and wood of the outer shelters. But the settlers were ready. Traps hidden along the ridge sent horses stumbling. A blast of fire from the oil lamps lit the path ahead, blinding the attackers. Holden fired his rifle, dropping one of Dalton's men from his saddle. The camp erupted into chaos. Ilara crouched behind a wagon, heart pounding, watching Koa move through the smoke like part of it. He fought with precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. When one rider came too close, Koa grabbed the reins, pulling the man down before he could fire again. The horse bolted and the man didn't rise. Still, they were outnumbered. Fought bravely, but for every rider that fell, two more seemed to appear. Dalton sat on his horse at a distance, watching like a man certain of victory. His men were trained, armed, and ruthless. Holden shouted, "They're breaking through the east side." Koa looked up. "Fall back to the ridge." Lara grabbed a rifle from the ground and followed, her hand shaking but steady enough to aim. She fired once, missing, but the shot startled a rider close enough for Koa to strike him down. She reloaded, her pulse racing. Smoke thickened in the air, the smell of gunpowder burning their throats. The sound of hooves and gunfire blended into a terrible rhythm. Koa reached the ridge, signaling Holden and the others to regroup. They formed a line behind the rocks, holding off the next assault. Then through the haze, Dalton's voice cut through. "Can't win, Apache. You think these people will stand with you? They'll leave you the first chance they get?" Koa didn't answer. His eyes searched the ridge below, where the remaining settlers were fighting to hold their ground. One woman fell, then another man. The line was thinning fast. Dalton rode closer now, rifle in hand. "Should have stayed out of this. This isn't your fight." Koa's voice came low and firm. "Became mine when you put that sign in the ground." Dalton's smirk faded. "Then you'll die for it." He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Ilara stepped out from behind the rocks. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dust, but her voice carried clear. "You took my life once, Dalton. You won't take it again." For a moment, time froze. Even the riders seemed unsure how to react. Dalton's rifle lowered slightly as he sneered. "You think anyone cares about what you say? You were nothing before me." Koa moved before Dalton could finish. The two men collided, the rifle knocked from Dalton's hand. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the dust. The horse bolted, and the men around shouted, unsure whether to fire or hold. Koa and Dalton struggled, the fight raw and desperate. Dalton was strong, but Koa moved with purpose born from fury and years of loss. The knife flashed once, catching the light, but Dalton struck it away and landed a blow that sent Koa reeling. Ilara ran toward them, but Holden's hand caught her arm. "No, you'll be caught in the fire." She hesitated, torn between fear and resolve. Around her, the settlers pushed forward again, refusing to let Dalton's men regain ground. Sound of the battle swelled until it was impossible to tell who was winning or losing. Dalton grabbed a fallen pistol and aimed it at Koa. "You should have known better," he hissed. "The world belongs to men like me." Koa, bleeding but steady, met his eyes. Not anymore. Before Dalton could pull the trigger, something changed in the air, a sound rising behind them. The settlers, rallied by Holden, had formed a line and were advancing. They had taken up fallen rifles, farm tools, anything that could serve. The outcasts, the forgotten, the ones who had been owned and beaten, were no longer running. Dalton turned, startled by the sudden defiance. His men, shaken and scattered, began to pull back. Smoke filled the valley, and the sun broke through in sharp rays that cut across the chaos like fire. Koa rose slowly, his body trembling with exhaustion. The sound of hooves retreating echoed in the distance as Dalton's men began to falter. But the fight wasn't over yet. Dalton was still there, the pistols still loaded, the hatred still burning in his eyes. Ilara stepped forward, her voice breaking but firm. "This ends today." The desert held its breath again. The moment stretched, every heartbeat loud in the silence that followed the gunfire. Dalton's finger tightened on the trigger and Koa took one step closer, and the tension was unbearable, the air itself trembling as everything that had been building the pain. The fear, the defiance balanced on the edge of that single moment. And then, somewhere far across the valley, a rifle cracked, splitting the silence. The final fight had begun. The shot that echoed through the valley broke the stillness like thunder. Dust rose around them, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Dalton staggered backward, his pistol slipping from his hand. For a moment, no one moved. His eyes widened in disbelief as he looked down, clutching his side. Koa stood only a few steps away, breathing hard, his knife still in hand, his face unreadable. Behind them, the settlers had fallen silent, watching as the man who had ruled through fear finally faltered. Dalton's horse reared and bolted, leaving him alone in the dirt. He fell to his knees, still trying to raise the pistol, but the strength was gone from his arm. He looked up at Koa, anger fading into something almost like confusion. "You don't understand," he rasped. "The world needs men like me. Order. Control." Koa shook his head slowly. "The world needs men who remember what mercy feels like." Dalton's eyes clouded as he sank to the ground, the dust swallowing his words. Around them, the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of retreating hooves. His riders were gone, scattered across the ridges. The fight was over. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the low crackle of the fires and the sigh of the wind filled the valley. The settlers stood in disbelief, staring at the man who had once owned their lives. Some wept. Others simply sank to the ground, exhausted. It wasn't victory that filled the air, it was relief. The kind that comes only after years of being silenced. Ilara's hands trembled as she stepped toward Koa. Her face was streaked with dust and tears. But there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's done," she whispered. Koa nodded slowly, his voice low. For now, he turned to look at the others. "But this land won't heal in a single sunrise. It'll take time." Holden came forward, wiping blood from his brow. "Then we'll give it time. We'll rebuild what he took from us." As the sun climbed higher, the survivors began to gather what was left of their camp. Fires were put out, wounds tended, and the dead laid gently in the shade of the mesquite trees. No one cheered, and no one celebrated. They worked quietly, like people who finally had permission to breathe. Ilara helped where she could, binding cuts and carrying water. She moved through the camp with a quiet strength, pausing sometimes to look out across the open desert. The sign that had once marked her as property still stood at the edge of the valley, leaning and splintered. She walked toward it, stopping a few steps away. The word carved into it caught the sunlight. Rough and ugly KOA came up behind her, saying nothing at first. Then, with his knife, he stepped forward and carved a deep line through the letters, splitting them down the middle. He dropped the blade into the dirt and said softly, "No one will ever wear that word again." Ilara looked at him, her throat tightening. "Do you think people like him will stop coming?" Koa's eyes followed the horizon. "No, men like him always find a way to return. But when they do, the world will be ready to stand against them." They walked back toward the camp as the sun began to dip. The others were gathering around Holden, who was speaking quietly about rebuilding. "There's land enough here for everyone," he was saying. "We'll plant again. We'll build homes. And when the next rider comes, he won't find us hiding." The people nodded, some smiling faintly for the first time. There was a kind of peace settling over them, the slow kind that grows after too much loss, as night came. Koa sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the stars. Ilara sat across from him, her voice soft. "When I first saw you, I thought you were part of a dream. I didn't think anyone would come for me." Koa's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "I didn't come for you. I came because no one should be left like that." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's the same thing." He looked into the fire for a long time. "You'll stay here? With them?" "I think so," she said quietly. "These people need each other." "I do too. But I won't forget what you did for me." Koa nodded. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she replied, her tone steady now. "That's what makes it matter." They sat in silence after that, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Around them, the camp had grown quiet. Some slept, others kept watch. The stars were clear above, and for the first time in a long while, there was no fear in the air. The next morning came with the smell of dew and the sound of birds returning to the trees. Koa rose early, packing what little he carried. Ilara found him near the horses, adjusting his saddle. "You're leaving," she said softly. He nodded. "There's more land out there, more people who need help." "My people taught me never to stay where the fight has ended." Ilara hesitated. "You could stay at least for a while." Koa gave a faint smile. "You don't need me here. You're stronger than you think." She stepped closer. "Then promise me something. Don't forget that you're not alone either." He met her eyes and nodded once. "I won't." Holden came up then, shaking Koa's hand firmly. "You'll always have a place here if you want it. You gave us back our courage." Koa mounted his horse, glancing over the camp one last time. The people were already working, fixing roofs, tending animals, building something new out of the ashes. Ilara stood a few paces away, her hair catching the morning light. She raised a hand in farewell, and Koa returned the gesture before turning toward the open desert. The land stretched endlessly ahead.
How wild and unforgiving.
But to Koa, it was alive again. The wind carried the scent of sage and freedom, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He didn't know where the trail would lead, but he knew his path wasn't done. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another battle waited, maybe not with guns or chains, but with the same old fight for dignity and belonging. As he rode away, the sun rose higher, painting the sky in gold and fire. Behind him, the valley shimmered with new life. The sign that had once read property now lay broken in the dust, its letters erased by wind and time. Ilara watched until he was only a small figure against the hills. Then she turned back toward the camp, her step steady. She picked up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. For the first time, it felt like her own. Weeks passed. The valley changed. Where Dalton's men had once built fences, now there were open fields. Holden kept his promise, leading the settlers in rebuilding without masters or chains. They planted crops, shared the work, and built homes that belonged to no one but those who lived in them. At night, Lara often sat by the fire and looked toward the horizon, wondering where Koa had gone. Sometimes she thought she saw him in her dreams, standing by the river, watching over them. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she carried his words with her. Freedom, he had said, is everyone's to fight for. One evening, as the last light faded, a small group of travelers arrived at the valley's edge. They looked worn and hungry, carrying little but hope. Ilara went to meet them, offering water and bread. When one of them asked if this land belonged to anyone, she smiled and said, "No, it belongs to those who choose to live free." In that moment, she realized something. The fight hadn't been only about breaking chains or defeating one man. It had been about remembering that no one is born to be owned, and no land, no heart, should ever carry a sign that says otherwise. Far to the west, Koa paused on a ridge, looking back once more at the valley below. The wind touched his face, and he thought of the people he'd left behind, the woman who had found her strength, the settlers who had found their voice, and the place that had found its soul again. He urged his horse forward, heading toward the horizon. The land stretched open before him, wild and endless, just as it had always been, and somewhere, carried on the wind, the faint sound of freedom lingered quiet, steady, and alive.